The silence was the first thing he noticed. It was not the peaceful quiet of an empty house awaiting a family's return, but a hollow, surgical silence. It was the sound of a vacuum, of a space where something had been forcibly removed. Elias Vance stood in the doorway of the home he had helped build, with his own hands, the scent of rain on asphalt clinging to his work jacket. The air inside was stale, holding the ghost of Clara's perfume, a scent that had once been a promise of homecoming, but now felt like an accusation. He dropped his heavy tool bag by the door, the thud unnervingly loud in the stillness. A fine layer of dust, visible in the slanted evening light, had settled on the dark wood of the console table. She had not been home to wipe it away. She had not been home for some time. He walked through the lower floor, his steel-toed boots echoing on the hardwood he had laid, and finished himself. Each plank, each joint was a memory. Here, by the fireplace, they had argued about the colour of the grout. There, in the kitchen, she had laughed as he'd tried to install the new faucet, spraying them both with water. These memories were now artifacts in a museum of a life that had apparently closed without notice. A gnawing dread, cold and heavy as lead, began to pool in his stomach. He called her name once. The sound was swallowed by the house. On the polished granite of the kitchen island, a place reserved for grocery lists and casual notes, sat a single white envelope. His name was written on it in her perfect, looping script. Beside it, glinting under the recessed lighting, was her wedding ring. It was placed with a cruel, deliberate precision, a tiny, golden monument to the end of everything. He stared at it for a long moment, his hands, calloused and stained with grease and the fine grit of concrete, hanging uselessly at his sides. These were the hands that had fixed her car, built her shelves, and held her as she slept. Now they felt alien, clumsy things incapable of the simple act of picking up a piece of paper. The note was short, its words sterile and efficient, as if severing a decade of shared life was a simple matter of logistics. She had met someone, Julian Croft. His name felt like a slap. Croft was a local developer, a man who moved in circles of soft hands, tailored suits, and easy money. He was everything Elias was not. Clara wrote of a life she felt she deserved, a life of comfort and status that Elias, with his dead-end career in construction, could never provide. The phrase stung more than the betrayal itself. She had seen his passion, his skill, the pride he took in creating things that would stand for a century, and she had distilled it all down to a simple, dismissive label. He read the note 3 times, the words blurring, the ink seeming to bleed into the fibers of the paper until they were just meaningless black marks. The cold dread in his gut had frozen into a solid block of ice, making it hard to breathe. He was not a man given to grand displays of emotion. His life was one of stoicism, of absorbing pressures and bearing loads. He was a builder, a foundation, the man who was supposed to be unshakable. But in the crushing silence of his empty home, he felt the first hairline fractures spiderwebbing through his core. Then he heard it. A small sound from upstairs, a cough. The block of ice in his chest cracked. He had forgotten. In the maelstrom of his own dissolving world, he had forgotten the secondary burden, the other life now tethered solely to his. He climbed the stairs, his steps heavy, each one a conscious effort against the immense gravity of his new reality. In the spare room, curled under a thin blanket, was his younger sister, Maya. She was 16, a whirlwind of teenage angst and trouble that had landed her in their care 6 months ago after their mother's passing. Clara had resented her presence from the start, another drain on resources, another complication in the perfect life she was curating. Now it was clear. Clara had not just left him, she had left them both. Maya's troubled, restless sleep was a testament to a different kind of abandonment. Elias looked at her, at the defiant streak of blue in her dark hair, and the vulnerable curve of her cheek, and the weight of the world, a weight he had always prided himself on carrying, settled onto his shoulders with a force that nearly buckled his knees. He was alone, with a mountain of shared debt Clara had conveniently forgotten to mention in her note, and a 16-year-old girl who looked at the world as if it were a fist about to strike. He closed the door softly and walked back downstairs, the letter crumpled in his fist. He stood in the center of the living room, a ghost in the ruins of his own life. The house he had built felt like a tomb. The silence pressed in, no longer just an absence of sound, but an active, suffocating presence. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage, speak to you, stay with me. This was not just an ending, it was the bottom, the muddy, debris-strewn ground floor from which a new structure, forged in grit and silence, would have to rise. The first few weeks were a blur of mechanical motion. Elias operated on a kind of grim autopilot, his mind cordoned off from the raw, screaming wound of the betrayal. He rose before the sun, the habit of a lifetime of labor, now a necessary anchor in the churning sea of his thoughts. He would make coffee, the bitter aroma filling the sterile kitchen, and stand at the window, watching the grey light seep into the sky. He did not think about Clara. He refused to. He thought about rebar tensile strength, the curing time of concrete in humid weather, the logistics of a crane lift scheduled for the following Tuesday. He filled his mind with the solid, tangible problems of his work, building a bulwark of professional calculations against the emotional tide that threatened to drown him. His home, once a source of pride, became a landscape of neglect. Dust bunnies gathered in the corners like small, grey animals, dishes piled up in the sink, a testament to meals eaten standing up, tasteless and purely for fuel. The perfectly manicured lawn he had once tended with obsessive care grew shaggy and unkempt, a visible manifestation of the chaos within. He and Maya moved through the space like two hostile ghosts, their orbits rarely intersecting. He would leave for work before she was fully awake, and return long after she had retreated into the digital glow of her bedroom, the door shut like a vault. The few words they exchanged were clipped and functional, transactions of information about school or the need for groceries, devoid of any warmth. He knew he was failing her, but the energy it would take to bridge the chasm between them felt like a luxury he could not afford. All his resources were being consumed by the simple, brutal act of putting one foot in front of the other. At work, the strain began to show. He was a foreman for a large construction firm, a job that required a sharp mind and an unwavering focus on 1,000 moving parts. But his focus was fractured. He would stare at a set of blueprints, the familiar lines and symbols swimming before his eyes, his mind drifting back to the glint of that wedding ring on the granite countertop. He became short-tempered with his crew, his usual patience worn down to a raw nerve. The easy camaraderie he had once shared with the men, the jokes traded over the rumble of heavy machinery, evaporated. They gave him a wide berth, sensing the storm raging behind his stony expression. His boss, Marcus Thorne, a man with a face like a road map of tough decisions and a gruff demeanor that hid a keen eye for character, watched him from a distance. Marcus did not pry, but Elias could feel his scrutiny, another weight on his already overloaded shoulders. The bills were a relentless tide of white envelopes, each one a reminder of the financial hole Clara had left him in. They had lived slightly beyond their means, a fact he had always been uneasy about, but one Clara had insisted was necessary to maintain appearances. Credit card statements, a second mortgage on the house he hadn't known the full extent of, the loan for her expensive car that was now, presumably, parked in Julian Croft's driveway. It was a suffocating mountain of debt, a second betrayal that was in some ways more insidious than the first. It was an anchor dragging him down, ensuring he could not easily escape the wreckage. He started taking on side jobs, small renovation projects on weekends, trading what little rest he had for a handful of cash to throw at the ever-growing pile of demands. Exhaustion became a permanent state of being, a low-grade fever that never broke. His body ached, a deep, cellular weariness that sleep could not touch. The nights were the worst. In the suffocating quiet of his half-empty bedroom, she had taken the best furniture, of course. The bulwark of work and logistics would crumble, and the thoughts he kept at bay during the day would come flooding in. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their last few months together, searching for the signs he had missed. Had he been blind, or just willfully ignorant? He saw her now, with a terrible clarity. The slight, dismissive curl of her lip when he came home covered in dust, the way her eyes would glaze over when he spoke with passion about his work, the increasing frequency of her nights out with friends. The clues had all been there, a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to this desolate place. He felt a fool. The anger, when it came, was a hot, searing thing, but it was quickly quenched by the cold, vast ocean of his despair. Anger required energy, and he had so little to spare. The breaking point, when it arrived, was not a dramatic explosion, but a small, pathetic collapse. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn. Rain lashed against the windows, a miserable, persistent drumming that mirrored the frantic pounding in his own skull. He had just returned from a brutal 14-hour day on site, a day where a subcontractor's error had set them back a week and earned him a blistering reprimand from Marcus. He was soaked through, his clothes cold and clammy against his skin. The house was dark. Maya was not home. A fresh wave of anxiety, sharp and acidic, rose in his throat. He had called her school earlier to check on a failing grade, only to be told she had skipped her last 2 classes. He found a note on the kitchen counter, a hastily scrawled message on a torn piece of notebook paper. "Gone to a party. Don't wait up." The casual defiance of it, the utter disregard for the fragile truce he was trying to maintain, was like a physical blow. He sank into a kitchen chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He was failing. He was failing at work, he was drowning in debt, and he was failing the one person he had left to protect. He looked around the messy kitchen, at the overflowing trash can, and the single dirty plate in the sink from his breakfast that morning. A smell of something sour, something rotting, emanated from the bin. It was the smell of his life. He put his head in his hands, the rough texture of his palms scraping against his stubbled cheeks. The pressure in his chest, the unshed tears, the silent screams he had been swallowing for weeks, all began to build into an unbearable crescendo. He felt a tremor start in his hands, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that spread through his entire body. He thought of Clara, of her easy smile and her casual cruelty. He thought of Julian Croft, a man who built nothing but his own bank account. He thought of the weight of the mortgage, the sneer in the banker's voice on the phone, the pitying looks from his crew. He thought of Maya, lost and adrift, and his own powerlessness to save her. And then it happened. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, guttural sob that was shocking in its intensity. It was the sound of a structure giving way, of support beams snapping, of a foundation cracking under an impossible load. He slid from the chair onto the cold linoleum floor, curling into a ball amidst the dust and grime. The sobs came in great, shuddering waves, shaking his entire frame. He wept for his lost love, for his shattered pride, for his naivete. He wept for the boy he had been, who believed in hard work and loyalty as absolute truths. He lay on the floor of the kitchen he had built, a broken man in a broken home, and for the first time since she had left, he let himself feel the full, crushing weight of it all. The rain beat against the glass, a relentless, unforgiving rhythm, as Elias Vance finally hit rock bottom. He did not know how long he lay on the cold kitchen floor. Time had dissolved into a grey fog of misery. The storm outside had passed, and the relentless drumming of the rain had softened to a gentle dripping from the eaves. The house was utterly silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was not the hollow, accusatory silence of abandonment, but the deep, profound quiet that follows a cataclysm. It was the silence of rubble. He pushed himself up slowly, his body stiff and aching, his face raw and streaked with the salt of his tears. He felt emptied, scoured out. The immense pressure that had been building inside him for weeks was gone, leaving behind a vast, desolate emptiness. He walked through the darkened house and up the stairs, moving with a strange, deliberate calm. He stopped at Maya's doorway. She had returned at some point, slipping in while he was lost in his own despair. She was asleep, her face illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through her window. The defiant blue streak in her hair seemed less like a challenge and more like a fragile defense. He saw not the source of his frustration, but a child who was just as lost and broken as he was. She had lost her mother, been abandoned by her father years ago, and now the woman who was supposed to be a surrogate mother figure had vanished, leaving her with a shattered, silent brother. Her anger, her rebellion, it was not aimed at him. It was a scream into the void. He stood there watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. And in that quiet moment, looking at the only family he had left, something shifted within him. The emptiness began to fill, not with the old despair, but with a new, cold and hard resolve. It was a feeling he recognized. It was the feeling he got when standing before a condemned building, a site of ruin and decay. He would not see the ruin. He would see the foundation. He would see the solid ground beneath the rubble. He would see what could be built in its place. He would not sink. He would not let Maya sink. He would build a new life from the wreckage, a structure so strong, so solid, that no storm could ever shake it again. The decision was not a thought, but a physical certainty. It settled into his bones a new kind of foundation. The next morning, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man who ran a classic car restoration shop, a man who had been coveting his father's 1968 Ford Mustang for years. The car sat in the garage, a half-finished project, a ghost of a more hopeful time. It was his only real treasure, a link to the father he had lost too soon. Selling it felt like cutting off a limb. But sentiment was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. The man's offer was fair, not generous, but it was enough. It was a start. It was the capital he needed to pour a new foundation. The second call was to the local community college. He enrolled in their night program for architectural technology and project management. The woman on the phone was patient as he stumbled through his questions. He felt old, out of place, a man of calloused hands and practical skills, venturing into a world of theory and academia. But the resolve held firm. His hands were not the dead end Clara had claimed. They were his starting point. Now he needed to train his mind to be as strong as his back, as precise as his eye. He needed to learn the language of the men who designed the buildings he constructed, the language of power, of contracts and blueprints and capital. His first class was a week later. He walked into the sterile, fluorescent-lit classroom feeling like an imposter. He was a decade older than most of the other students, his work clothes a stark contrast to their casual, collegiate attire. He took a seat in the back, hoping to remain invisible. The instructor walked in and his heart sank a little. She was young, sharp, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Her name was Lena Petrova. She moved with an air of crisp, no-nonsense competence. She began the lecture, her voice clear and precise, and Elias felt a flicker of the old insecurity. What was he doing here? He was a construction foreman, not a student. Lena's teaching style was demanding. She did not lecture, she challenged. She would pose a problem, a complex structural or logistical puzzle, and expect the class to work through it. In the third week, she put a notoriously difficult design flaw on the projector, a real-world case study that had resulted in a partial collapse. "What went wrong here?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the room. The students offered tentative theories about material fatigue and soil composition. Elias stayed silent, but he saw it instantly. It was not a grand, complex failure. It was a small, stupid mistake, a miscalculation in the load distribution from a secondary support beam, something a seasoned foreman would spot in a heartbeat. "Anyone else?" Lena pressed, her eyes landing on him in the back row. "Mr. Vance, you've been quiet all semester. Do you have a theory, or are you just here to warm a chair?" The directness of the challenge startled him. He felt a flush of anger, but it was quickly replaced by the cold resolve. He was not here to be invisible. He was here to learn, to grow, to build. He met her gaze. "It wasn't the soil or the steel," he said, his voice rougher than the others, carrying the gravel of 1,000 dusty work sites. The architect discounted the dynamic load from the HVAC unit on the roof. They tied its support structure into a non-load-bearing purlin instead of the main truss. It was fine for a year, then a heavy snow added another 2,000 pounds of static load, and the whole thing sheared off. The room went quiet. Lena stared at him, her expression unreadable. She walked to the projector and zoomed in on the exact section of the blueprint he had described. She tapped the screen. "He's right," she said to the class, a note of surprise in her voice. "Completely right." She looked back at Elias, and for the first time he saw not a dismissive academic, but something else. Respect. It was a small moment, a tiny victory, but for Elias, it felt like the first solid block being laid in his new foundation. He was no longer just a man in the back of the room. He was a builder. And his new ally, whether she knew it yet or not, had just seen the first glimpse of the architect he was determined to become. The next 7 years were a relentless grind. Time did not pass in seasons, but in semesters completed, in projects finished, in the slow, incremental reduction of his debt. Elias's life narrowed to a singular focus, a long, arduous climb out of the trench. His days were a blur of raw physicality and mental exertion. He would spend 10 hours on a construction site, his body absorbing the familiar aches of manual labor, his mind tracking the complex choreography of men and machines. Then he would drive straight to the community college, shedding his dusty work persona at the classroom door. He would sit under the fluorescent lights, his hands still bearing the faint grime of the day's work, and immerse himself in the abstract world of structural engineering, contract law, and architectural design. His nights were spent at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had once hosted dinner parties, now covered in blueprints, textbooks, and scattered notes. He would study until his eyes burned, the numbers and figures blurring into an indecipherable mess. Sleep was a brief, precious commodity, a few stolen hours before the cycle began again. he sold the house he had built, a decision that was both pragmatic and deeply symbolic. It was too big, too full of ghosts, and the mortgage was a millstone. He and Maya moved into a small, functional apartment in a less fashionable part of town. The sale of the house cleared the last of the joint debt Clara had left behind, a final cleansing act of severing his past. The feeling was not of loss, but of liberation. He was free of the last financial shackle. His relationship with Maya slowly, painstakingly began to heal. In the cramped quarters of their new apartment, they could no longer avoid each other. The silence that had defined their existence in the big house was no longer possible. He started making a point to be home for dinner, even if it meant reheating something from a container while hunched over a textbook. He would ask her about her day, and at first her answers were monosyllabic grunts, but he persisted. He helped her with her homework, his practical understanding of physics and geometry proving surprisingly useful. He attended her parent-teacher conferences, a quiet, imposing figure in his work boots who listened intently and spoke with a low, serious gravity that made the teachers sit up a little straighter. Slowly, she began to see him not as a broken, distant figure, but as a constant, unwavering presence. The blue streak in her hair faded, replaced by her natural color. The anger in her eyes softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. One evening, as he was struggling with a particularly complex design problem for a class project, she came and sat opposite him. "That angle is wrong," she said, pointing a finger at his drawing. "The shear stress will be too high." Elias looked up, surprised. She had been watching him, learning by osmosis. A rare, small smile touched his lips. It was the first time he had truly smiled in years. At work, Marcus Thorne's scrutiny evolved into a form of gruff mentorship. Marcus had seen dozens of men burn out, crack under the pressure of life outside the job site. He had expected Elias to be another casualty. Instead, he saw a man who was hardening, focusing, channeling his private pain into a formidable professional discipline. Elias was no longer just a good foreman, he was becoming a strategic thinker. He saw not just the immediate task, but the entire scope of the project, anticipating problems before they arose, finding efficiencies others missed. Marcus started giving him more responsibility, putting him in charge of more complex and challenging builds. He would hand Elias a set of problematic blueprints and say, "Fix it." And Elias would. He would sit with the architects, men in crisp shirts, who initially looked down on the dusty foreman, and he would point out their errors with a quiet, irrefutable logic born from years of seeing their designs become reality. His relationship with Lena Petrova deepened in parallel. After his incisive analysis in her class, she had sought him out. Their conversations started with coursework, but quickly expanded. She was fascinated by his dual perspective, the man who understood both the theory of the blueprint and the hard reality of its execution. She was an architect at a small, ambitious firm, and she began to bring him her own professional challenges, spreading her firm's blueprints across a table in a quiet corner of the college library. He would trace the lines with a calloused finger, his insights practical and invaluable. "This looks good on paper," he would say, "but the plumbing chase is too narrow. You'll never fit the ductwork in there. You'll lose a week tearing out that wall." Their late-night study sessions evolved into something more. They were two people dedicated to the craft of building, finding in each other a shared language and a mutual respect that was as solid as concrete. There was no dramatic romance, no sudden revelation. It was a slow burn, a structure built piece by piece over years of shared struggle and intellectual camaraderie. He admired her sharp mind and her unwavering belief in his potential. She saw past the stoic, hardened exterior to the brilliant, resilient man beneath. She was the first person since the fall who had looked at him and not seen a victim. She saw a builder. One evening, after they had spent hours redesigning a flawed structural plan for her firm, she had reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His hands were no longer as rough, the deep calluses softened by long hours holding a pen instead of a hammer, but they were still the hands of a man who worked. Her touch was not one of pity, but of partnership. It was a simple, profound gesture of acceptance. The years passed. Elias graduated at the top of his class, with a recommendation from Lena and a surprisingly effusive one from Marcus Thorne. He was hired by Lena's firm as a junior project manager. He traded his tool belt for a clipboard, his work boots for polished leather shoes. The physical aches of his old life were replaced by the mental exhaustion of managing multi-million-dollar projects. He and Marcus, no longer boss and employee, became partners on a speculative venture, buying a dilapidated warehouse and converting it into sought-after loft apartments. The project was a resounding success. Elias reinvested his earnings, starting his own small development company with Lena as his head, architect, and partner. They were a formidable team, his practical genius and her design vision, creating buildings that were both beautiful and flawlessly executed. His physical appearance transformed. The perpetual exhaustion was replaced by a quiet, confident energy. He wore tailored suits that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was shorter, flecked with distinguished grey at the temples. The stoic mask had not disappeared, but the despair behind it had been replaced by a calm, watchful intelligence. He had not just rebuilt his life, he had engineered a new one on his own terms from a superior design. Maya, thriving under his stable care, graduated high school with honors and was accepted into a prestigious engineering program. The day he dropped her off at her college dorm, she had hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for not giving up." One day, an invitation arrived in the mail. It was for his 20-year high school reunion. He almost threw it away. He had no interest in revisiting the past. But Lena saw it. "You should go," she said. "You should let them see who you are now." She smiled. "Besides, I hear the venue is spectacular, the Argent Hotel, a classic Art Deco building, beautifully restored. I've always wanted to see it." Elias looked at the invitation again. The Argent Hotel. A flicker of a private, ironic smile touched his lips. He knew the venue intimately. He knew every beam, every wire, every pane of glass. He knew the precise mix of the concrete in its new foundation. "All right," he said, his eyes meeting Lena's. "Let's go." He had spent 7 years burying the past. Perhaps it was time to finally stand on top of it. Julian Croft's financial empire, built on a foundation of risky leverage and outright fraud, did not so much collapse as it did detonate. The news broke in a spectacular fashion, splashed across the business journals and local news, indictments for securities fraud, a pyramid of debt that suddenly came due, and a string of betrayed investors left in his wake. Julian, the charismatic developer with the Midas touch, was revealed to be a common grifter in an expensive suit. His assets were frozen, his properties seized, and he disappeared from the public eye, rumored to have fled the country ahead of the authorities. Clara was left with nothing. She had been a showpiece, a beautiful accessory to Julian's performance of wealth. When the performance ended, she was discarded like a costume. The luxurious penthouse, the European cars, the endless credit. It all vanished overnight. She was left with a wardrobe of designer clothes she couldn't sell for a fraction of their cost, and the bitter, humiliating reality of her own miscalculation. She had traded loyalty for status, substance for glitter, and the glitter had turned out to be cheap foil. She retreated from the city, her social circle evaporating as quickly as Julian's fortune. For a time, she was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered at the cocktail parties she could no longer attend. But desperation is a powerful motivator. Living in a cramped apartment, working a demeaning retail job, the memory of the life she'd had, both with Julian and, she now recalled, with a selective, self-serving nostalgia, with Elias became an unbearable torment. She began to hear whispers. Rumors of Elias Vance, not the man she had left, the dusty construction worker with his dead-end career, but a new Elias, a developer, a success. The name of his firm, Vance Petrova Development, started appearing on high-profile projects around the city. She saw a magazine feature on the stunning renovation of a historic downtown warehouse into luxury lofts, and there he was in a photograph. He looked different. Older, yes, but harder, more formidable. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit. The quiet, unassuming man she had so easily dismissed was gone. In his place was a man who radiated a calm, unnerving power, and standing beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, was a sharp, elegant woman with intelligent eyes, Lena Petrova. The sight of it, of his success, of his new partner, ignited a toxic cocktail of emotions in Clara. Envy, resentment, and a desperate, grasping hope. She had made a mistake. Not in leaving Elias, her pride would not allow her to admit that, but in choosing the wrong replacement. She saw Elias's success not as something he had earned, but as something that rightfully should have been hers. She had put in the years, hadn't she? She had been his wife. Surely she was entitled to a piece of this new life he had built. The upcoming 20-year high school reunion presented itself as the perfect opportunity. It was a public stage, a place where social pressures could be applied. She would approach him not as a penitent, but as a victim of circumstance, a woman wronged by a cruel world. She would appeal to the good, kind, naive man she remembered, the man who had always been a sucker for a sad story. She would remind him of their shared history, of the life they once had. And if pity and nostalgia failed to work, she had other ideas. She was, after all, still a survivor. She would find a way to reclaim what she had lost. Her plan began to form, a desperate, manipulative strategy to re-enter his life and lay claim to the empire he had built without her. She bought a dress on credit, a striking, dramatic gown designed to make a statement, and prepared herself for the confrontation. She was going to the reunion to get her life back. The Argent Hotel was a monument to a bygone era, lovingly restored to its former glory. As Elias and Lena stepped out of the car, he paused for a moment, looking up at the magnificent Art Deco facade. Intricate bronze metalwork framed the grand entrance, and the original terracotta panels, once stained with decades of grime, now glowed warmly under the spotlights. He had spent 2 years of his life on this building. He knew its secrets, its flaws, its strengths. He had walked its skeletal framework in the pouring rain, argued with engineers over a 1/4-inch tolerance, and personally selected the marble for the lobby floor. To everyone else, it was a beautiful hotel. To him, it was a testament, a physical manifestation of his long journey from the rubble. Lena slipped her arm through his. "It's breathtaking," she whispered, her architect's eye taking in the masterful detailing. "You should be so proud." "We should be proud," he corrected her gently. Her design for the rooftop bar, a stunning glass atrium that seemed to float above the city, had won 3 architectural awards. This building was as much hers as it was his. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. They walked into the grand lobby, and the sound of the city outside was replaced by the low, hum of conversation, and the clink of glasses. The reunion was in full swing in the main ballroom. Faces from a distant past swam before his eyes, some vaguely familiar, others changed by 2 decades of life. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if watching a film about someone else's life. He was not the awkward, quiet boy they had known. He was a different man entirely, a man forged in a crucible they could not possibly imagine. He and Lena found a quiet table near the edge of the room. He had no desire to plunge into the maelstrom of forced nostalgia. He was content to observe, to be present with the woman who was his present and his future. They spoke quietly, their conversation easy and familiar, a comfortable counterpoint to the strained cheerfulness of the room. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced his past by coming here, and he had found it had no power over him. Then he saw her. Clara was standing across the room, a glass of champagne in her hand, her eyes scanning the crowd. She wore a dramatic, backless red dress, a calculated choice designed to command attention. She looked older, the lines of discontent etched faintly around her eyes and mouth, but she was still undeniably beautiful. Her gaze swept the room, and then it locked onto his. A slow, deliberate smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator that has just spotted its prey. She began to move toward them, gliding through the crowd with a practiced grace. Elias felt a subtle tensing in his gut, a ghost of the old dread, but it was faint, a distant echo. He placed his hand over Lena's, a silent reassurance. "Don't worry," he murmured. "I've been expecting this." Clara arrived at their table, her perfume, a different, more expensive scent than the one he remembered, preceding her. "Elias," she said, her voice a breathy, intimate purr. "I almost didn't recognize you. You look, well." Her eyes flickered over his suit, then to Lena, a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Clara," he replied, his voice even, neutral. "This is my partner, Lena Petrova." "Partner," Clara repeated, tasting the word. "Business, I assume." The question was laced with a delicate, manufactured innocence. "In business and in life," Lena answered smoothly, her voice calm, but with an underlying firmness that Clara could not miss. She extended a hand. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard so little about you." The subtle barb hit its mark. A flicker of annoyance crossed Clara's face before she masked it with a radiant smile. "The past is the past, isn't it?" she said, turning her full attention back to Elias. "My God, it's been a lifetime. I heard about what happened with Julian. A terrible business. He completely fooled me, you know. I'm such a poor judge of character." She sighed, dramatically, placing a hand on her chest. "I suppose I've always been drawn to men with ambition, but I keep picking the wrong ones." The performance was flawless. She was casting herself as the victim, the naive woman taken in by a con man, subtly drawing a parallel to her departure from Elias, as if he, too, had been a flawed choice on a grander spectrum of her romantic misfortunes. She was trying to build a bridge of shared victimhood. "It's funny," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I remember when you were so passionate about your work, getting your hands dirty. I never understood it then. This," she gestured vaguely at the opulent ballroom, "this is so much more you. I guess you finally realized that a man can't build an empire with a hammer." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was meant to be charming, but grated on his nerves. She was mocking the very foundation of his success, the years of physical labor, dismissing it as a crude and primitive phase he had thankfully outgrown. She was trying to align herself with the man he was now, positioning herself as someone who had always known he was destined for this, if only he would shed his blue-collar skin. Elias remained silent, his expression unreadable. He let her talk, let her spin her narrative. He had learned long ago that the most powerful move in a negotiation was to let the other side reveal their entire strategy first. Lena sat beside him, a quiet, solid presence. She did not intervene. She trusted him completely. Seeing that her performance of remorse and shared ambition was having no visible effect, Clara's tone shifted. The soft, pity-seeking facade began to crack, revealing the harder, more manipulative core beneath. "You know, Elias," she said, her voice lowering, taking on a sharper, more serious edge. "I was looking through some old papers the other day. It's amazing what you find, things you forget all about." She took a deliberate sip of her champagne, her eyes fixed on his, over the rim of the glass. "Our divorce, for instance, it was all so rushed, so messy. I'm not even entirely sure my lawyer at the time filed the final decree correctly. A technicality, I'm sure. But you know how the law is. A missing signature, a docket number never entered. It can mean things aren't quite as final as one might think." There it was. The blackmail. The leverage. It was a clumsy, desperate gambit, but she delivered it with the confidence of a woman who believed she held a winning card. She was implying that they were, on some legal technicality, still married, that she was, therefore, entitled to a share of the wealth, the empire he had built in the years since she had abandoned him. She was no longer appealing to his pity, but to his fear. Fear of a messy, public legal battle that could tarnish his reputation and cost him a fortune. She mistook his silence for shock, his stillness for vulnerability. She believed she had him cornered. "Imagine that," she continued, pressing her advantage. "All this success, and for it to be built on a foundation that isn't quite solid." She smiled, a cold, triumphant little smile. "But I'm not a monster, Elias. I don't want to cause a scene. I'm sure we could come to a private, mutually beneficial arrangement, a way to correct the oversight and ensure we both have the security we deserve." The audacity of it was breathtaking. She was trying to use the language of builders, of foundations against him, unaware of the profound irony. She saw his life as a house of cards she could topple with a single, well-placed puff of legal threats. She saw the quiet, stoic man before her, and assumed he was the same naive, easily wounded man she had left behind. She had no idea that the stoicism was no longer a defense mechanism, but a weapon. She had no idea that he had spent 7 years learning to think 10 moves ahead, to anticipate every stress point, to engineer systems that could withstand any pressure. Elias finally moved. He leaned forward slightly, placing his hands flat on the table. He looked at Clara, and for the first time that evening, he let her see a flicker of the man he had become. Not a man of anger, but of absolute, chilling certainty. "You're right, Clara," he said, his voice quiet. Yet it cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a shard of glass. "It is amazing what you find when you look through old papers." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the space between them. "Our divorce was finalized 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days ago. At 2:17 in the afternoon, to be precise. Your lawyer, a Mr. Abernathy, filed the final decree with the county clerk. It was docket number 7B 4418. Your signature, which you provided in front of a notary public, is on page 5 of the settlement agreement, a copy of which my lawyer has in a fireproof safe. I also have a digital copy stored on a secure server and a hard copy in my office." Clara's smile faltered. The color began to drain from her face. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. There was no fear, no panic, only a calm, methodical recitation of facts. As for your lawyer, Elias continued, his voice remaining level, Mr. Abernathy was disbarred 2 years ago for, among other things, mishandling client funds and what the State Bar called a pattern of gross incompetence. If you had bothered to do even the slightest bit of research, you would know that any case he handled has been under review. Mine was one of the first to be audited. It was found to be perfectly, immutably solid. He let that sink in. He had not just moved on, he had fortified his position. He had anticipated this, or some version of this, for years. He had prepared. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Clara's triumphant expression had curdled into one of disbelief and dawning horror. Her bluff had not just been called, it had been dismantled with surgical precision. But she was not done. Humiliation quickly turned to a spiteful rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she spat, her voice a venomous whisper. "Hiding in your fancy hotel, wearing your fancy suit. But you're still just the man who gets his hands dirty, a glorified bricklayer. You can put on a suit, Elias, but you can't erase what you are. This," she gestured around the room again, her hand trembling with fury, "this isn't your world. You're just visiting. You're a fraud, playing at being a gentleman in a place you could never truly belong." Her words, meant to be the final killing blow, the insult that would cut him back down to size, hung in the air. Elias looked at her, and he felt nothing. Not anger, not pain, only a profound, weary pity. She was still fighting a battle that had ended 7 years ago against a man who no longer existed. Just then, a man in a sharp hotel manager's uniform approached their table, his expression harried. He ignored Clara completely, his focus entirely on Elias. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice low and urgent. "My apologies for interrupting, but we have an issue with the climate control in the West Wing. The new sensors are giving conflicting readings. Could you possibly take a look?" "The on-site engineer is stumped." Clara stared, her mouth slightly agape. She looked from the manager back to Elias, a dawning, sickening confusion in her eyes. "Mr. Vance?" she repeated, the name sounding foreign on her lips in this context. Elias nodded to the manager. "Give me 5 minutes, David. I'll meet you at the control panel on the mezzanine." The manager nodded gratefully and hurried away. Elias turned his gaze back to Clara. Her face was a mask of utter bewilderment. He leaned back in his chair, a final, quiet act of power. "You were saying something about my dead-end career?" he asked, his voice soft, devoid of any malice. It was a simple question, but it landed with the force of a wrecking ball. "Something about me not belonging here?" He gestured with an open hand, a gesture that encompassed the entire magnificent room, the soaring ceilings, the gleaming chandeliers, the very floor beneath their feet. "It's funny you should mention it. This place, the Argent. I didn't just book a table, Clara." He paused, letting the final, devastating truth settle. "My firm bought the building 2 years ago. We handled the restoration. The very floor you're standing on, Lena and I, designed it. The beams holding up this ceiling, I signed off on every one of them. The faulty sensor in the West Wing is my problem to solve because the entire hotel is my property. My dead-end career didn't just get me a seat at the table. It allowed me to build the whole damn table." The blood drained completely from Clara's face. She looked as if she had been physically struck. The sound of the party, the laughter, the music, all seemed to fade into a distant roar. In that moment she was utterly and completely defeated, not by rage or revenge, but by a quiet, irrefutable truth. She had mocked the man for being a builder, blind to the fact that he had built an empire while she had been busy decorating a fool's penthouse. Her entire world-view, her belief in status over substance, had been invalidated in a single, devastating blow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. She had built her life on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. Clara stood frozen for a long, silent moment, the vibrant red of her dress a stark, garish contrast to the pale shock on her face. The carefully constructed artifice of her confidence, her beauty, her perceived leverage, it all crumbled at once, leaving behind only the raw, pathetic reality of her desperation. The eyes of a few people at nearby tables, drawn by the sudden shift in tension, were now on them. She was no longer the center of attention in the way she had intended. She was a spectacle of a different kind, a woman whose desperate gamble had failed in the most public and humiliating way possible. Without another word, she turned and walked away, not with the graceful glide she had used to approach them, but with a stiff, jerky motion. She did not look back. She simply dissolved into the anonymous churn of the crowd, a ghost finally and permanently exorcised. Elias watched her go, and the emotion that washed over him was not the hot, satisfying thrill of victory he might have once imagined. It was not triumph. It was not even the cold satisfaction of a well-executed plan. It was something far quieter, far more profound. It was lightness, a weight he had not even been fully conscious of carrying for 7 long years, the last lingering residue of her betrayal, the faint, toxic stain on his soul, had finally, completely lifted. He felt a deep, cleansing exhale in his spirit, the kind of release that comes after a long and brutal fever finally breaks. He was free. He turned his attention back to the only person in the room who mattered. Lena was looking at him, her expression a mixture of fierce pride and gentle love. She had been his silent, unwavering support throughout the entire exchange, a testament to the deep trust and partnership they had built. She had known he was more than capable of handling the ghosts of his past, and she had given him the space to do it on his own terms. She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. Her touch was an anchor, grounding him in the solid, beautiful reality of the present. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her gaze searching his. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes for the first time that night. It was a smile of pure, unburdened peace. "I'm better than okay," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "I'm finished." It was the truth. That chapter of his life, the one defined by pain and struggle and the long, arduous climb out of the dark, was over. Clara was no longer a character in his story. She was just a footnote in a preface that no one needed to read anymore. He stood up, pulling Lena gently to her feet. "The manager is waiting for me," he said, "but he can wait a few more minutes." He led her away from the noise of the ballroom, through a discreet door he knew led to a series of service corridors. He navigated the quiet, utilitarian spaces with an easy familiarity. The hidden arteries of the building he knew as well as the back of his own hand. He led her up a narrow flight of stairs to a heavy steel door. He pushed it open, and they stepped out into the cool night air. They were on a small, private balcony, an architectural quirk he had insisted on preserving during the renovation. It was tucked away, invisible from the street below, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. The endless grid of light spread out before them like a blanket of scattered diamonds. Many of those lights were in buildings he had worked on, buildings he had helped raise from the ground up. The city was a map of his life, of his labor, of his ascent. He and Lena stood in comfortable silence for a long time, the distant sounds of traffic a soft murmur below. The wind was cool on his face, carrying the scent of the city, concrete, asphalt, and the distant promise of more rain. He put his arm around her, drawing her close. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a perfect fit. This was his empire. It was not the steel and glass monolith of the Argent Hotel. It was not the portfolio of successful projects or the healthy bank account. It was this quiet moment, this shared strength, this woman who had seen the architect inside the builder, who had handed him blueprints when all he had was a hammer, and who had stood by his side as they built a new world together. The buildings were just steel and stone. This was real. This was permanent. He looked out at the sprawling, glittering city he had helped to shape. Then he looked down at the woman who had helped to reshape him. The past was a closed book. The future was an open blueprint, waiting for them to draw the lines. "Let's go home," he said. And together they turned away from the view and walked back into the warmth and light of the life they had built.